Creating God, it has been told to us since the very beginning that you are truly the Lord of all that is and ever shall be. You are the God of both the prince and pauper, of feast and famine, of the mighty and the weak, and yet you do not favor the strong over the powerless. Remind us of your love as we read the Scriptures. O God of true justice, open our eyes, open our hearts, that we may be strengthened and renewed by your word. Amen. So we are still in Matthew's Gospel. We're in the 16th chapter, and we're reading from verse 21 through 28. Let us listen for what the Spirit may be speaking to the church. From that time on, Jesus began to show his disciples that he must go to Jerusalem and undergo great suffering at the hands of the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and on the third day be raised. And Peter took him aside and began to rebuke him, saying, God forbid it, Lord, this must never happen to you. But he turned and said to Peter, Get behind me, Satan. For you are a stumbling block for me. For you are setting your mind not on divine things, but on human things. Then Jesus told his disciples, If any want to become my followers, let them deny themselves and take up their cross and follow me. For those who want to save their life will lose it, and those who lose their life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit them if they gain the whole world but forfeit their life? Or what will they give in return for their life? For the Son of Man is to come with his angels in the glory of God, and then will repay everyone for what has been done. Truly, I tell you, there are some standing here who will not taste death before they see the Son of Man coming in the kingdom. This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God.
So it happened that Peter has gone from being the rock upon which the Church of Jesus Christ will be built to a stumbling block in less than a few short moments. And we have to ask ourselves, how did this happen? It was the previous passage, literally the previous passage, where Peter has said, You are the rock. You are the one who this has been revealed to. On you I will build my church. And yet, immediately following this, we have Peter being called Satan. So we ought to take note. How did the one who knew Jesus was the Messiah, the Son of the living God, end up being in league with Satan? The very rock which Jesus hands the keys of the kingdom and power unknown before has now become a stumbling block, who Jesus quickly and eventually publicly puts him back in his place. So what happened? How did the rock become the stumbling block? Well, the short answer is, as we all know well, disciples are a forgetful lot. From Peter all the way down to us, we forget again and again what it means to follow the one who went all the way to the cross. Now, for Peter's benefit, he did not know at this point what was to come. Even though Jesus was actually preaching it, maybe he just didn't want to hear it. Disciples do that too. And so Jesus is in this moment pointing it out in a very forceful way that frankly doesn't sound pastoral, and I'm glad Jesus is doing it and not saying we should do that to others. I don't think that's the pastor's or disciples' job. We'll let Jesus call people out. But in this passage, immediately before, Peter's praised with high praise for what he has said, and then he's given significant power. And that power, I think, has gone to his head. Peter is clearly drunk with that power, and I will point that out where I see that happening. The problem is with the power that he's received in a worldly sense, it is to give one person too much power is always a bad thing. And then they come to believe that they have godlike power. Now you might think I'm stretching the text a little bit, but here's the thing. Peter is said to rebuke Jesus. Now, why is that important? This is the language that Jesus uses when he stops the storm on the sea. He rebukes the wind and the waves. Jesus rebukes the demons of the world with this language. With this language of rebuke, Jesus challenges and stops the demonic power in the world. And here we have Peter using that same sort of process. Peter thinks that a God who would sacrifice himself for other people must be in league with Satan and has to be stopped. Peter is not saying to Jesus, we'd miss you if you died. He doesn't say to him, Jesus, we love you so much, we just don't want you hurt. No, Peter is telling, not just telling, he's demanding that Jesus shut up. That's what that rebuke means. Silence. So here you have Peter who's come to believe that he has power over Jesus. Now, I know we would never think that way, of course not. But in some ways we do, because Jesus has to be on our side. Jesus has to vote the way we do. Jesus had to have chosen our nation. Jesus would approve of power politics. But when we fall into those traps, it shows we've lost our mind and we are just like Peter. So we're not alone when we make these mistakes. The problem with power is what happened with Peter. When it comes to this power, Jesus has to teach Peter and the rest of us a lesson. You see, when Jesus calls Peter Satan, it's pretty significant. He tries to put him in his place, and I think he's doing two things. The first is he's trying to get Peter's attention. If Jesus looked at you and called you Satan, you might pay closer attention. I know that I would. I'm not going to have you visualize that this week, by the way. But I also think that he does it to remind Peter of Jesus' own struggle with power. I'll get there in a minute. What would it feel like to be in Peter's shoes, to hear that he's trying to protect Jesus? Jesus doesn't need our protection, by the way, but he's trying to protect Jesus. You can't suffer, you can't do any of these things, and here, lo and behold, trying to do something he thinks is right, and Jesus calls him Satan. He must have felt a level of horror, must have felt a level of embarrassment, and probably on some level a bit of anger. If you've ever been called out, even when it was necessary to be called out, your first response wasn't, oh, okay. It's hard to tell exactly what Peter was feeling, but for now, what we do know is that Jesus has Peter's full attention. So when Jesus calls Peter Satan, it should take us back to the only other time the word Satan ever shows up in the Gospel of Matthew. The temptation stories. In fact, in some ways, this moment parallels Jesus' own moment. You see, Jesus was baptized by John, and when he is, right after that moment, the heavens are torn open, and a voice says, "This is my Son, the beloved, listen to him." In this moment, Jesus is now prepared to go out and to live and to serve and to love and to be on his ministry. And right there in the midst of this, he receives a divine blessing and then is thrown out in the wilderness and tempted. And the temptations, these temptations that are put before Jesus, every one of them is about how he will and will not use power. Last week, Peter is elevated. He is blessed, given special title, and this week, he is tested and fails. But at least he's not rebuked. Jesus in the desert had to wrestle with the use of his power. When Jesus was tempted in the wilderness, he was tempted to use his power to meet his own needs. He was tempted to use that power for his own needs, bread, or to end his vulnerability, or to exercise his power over others. I won't unpack that whole temptation story, but it's enough to say that does cover the basis. And what we find out is this, and these are the risks of power. That we will use what power we have for ourselves to end our vulnerability and then to exercise power over others. Jesus says it is the Gentiles who lord power over them, but it will not be so with you. So when anyone in any position of authority and power does these things, it is clear that they are not following the path laid out by Jesus for his followers. The temptation story in the wilderness is not just about Jesus' power to resist. It is more. It is a reminder about the wrong uses of power, and Peter has forgotten. And this is why Jesus has to shake him into a new consciousness. And if calling Peter Satan is not enough, Jesus goes even further. He teaches Peter and then turns to the crowd and uses this image. The cross. Now, it doesn't have the same power for us. We're not at risk of seeing the cross in our communities, anything other than a sign of the Christian faith or as a piece of jewelry. But the cross in the Roman Empire was an implement of torture and humiliation. It, yes, killed people, but really slowly and painfully. It was meant as a symbol to cower populations and to make people fearful. It was a slow and painful death meant to inflict horrible pain and kill very slowly. It was sadistic. But in the end, the cross has become to symbolize that the powers of this world do not have the last word. They may have the power to kill, but they do not have the power to bring life. They do not have absolute power. And this is what Peter needs to be reminded of. This is what the followers of Jesus need to be reminded of when we scrap and script and try to reach for power over others. When we forget that when we are given authority, we're called to serve and love instead of, well, make it about ourselves. And here's the thing about the powers of the world. At the end of the day, they know that it's limited. They know that it's a loose grasp that they have on society. That's why they have to set up barricades early and sneak out the door after verdicts are listed. And yet the powers at the end of the day are afraid. They're afraid, even though they're the ones with the weapons to kill. And so Jesus says in the midst of this, in the midst where the revolutionaries around him are suggesting to pick up arms, where the Roman Empire is saying, just enrich yourselves, become a tax collector, be part of the empire, Jesus said there's another way. Not easy, but it is the way of the cross. It is not what it seems. It is not becoming a doormat. It's not about being powerless. What does he mean when he says we will give up our lives and learn that we have more than we ever thought? When we try to seek just our own, we find that we end up losing our lives in the process. What is it that is about this way of the cross? Well, I don't think it is, as some have said, everybody's got their cross to bear. Mine is plantar fasciitis. Actually, it is, but it's not a cross. No, I think the cross is way more than about what my personal aches and pains or troubles of the world might be. In fact, I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about at all. We will face trouble in our lives, but this is about choosing. It is not something thrust upon us. Jesus says, pick up your cross. It is about location. Here's what I mean. The cross is about placing ourselves, our lives, our interests with the powerless over the powerful. Not seeking to gain power and use power for ourselves, or to control our Jesus, or to keep things the way we like them. Instead, giving of our whole selves for others and for the world. All of a sudden, we'll find out that life was meant to be shared. This was the problem with Peter. He wanted to keep Jesus safe and boxed in and comfortable and okay. He probably did decide to do this out of love, and yet he still ends up using power in a way where he failed. It's enough to say that we know that this is a risk for us today as well. It is easy to lose sight of our calling in our lives. We are called to join with the powerless, to stand with those who have been afflicted, those who are ignored, those who are imprisoned, those who are excluded, even if the system says it's supposed to be that way. Any system, any institution, anything that is not life-giving needs and is a call for us to resist. And this is where the cross comes in, because when you resist the powers of the world wherever they show up, you find out really quickly the privileges that you thought you had are not as permanent as you thought. If we cast our lots, as Jesus said, with the powerless, picking up our cross, we will be treated just like those who are already having the cross thrust upon them. Privilege is fleeting, especially if we pick up the cross. Our calling is to always stand with those who have been excluded from the places of power, and Peter and the other disciples had it in their minds going to Jerusalem that they were just going in to be the new regime. They expected it to be regime change. They were going to get rid of all of those, the scribes, the Pharisees, the leaders, and then they were going to get rid of Rome. And it was a massive surprise. That instead, Jesus says, I'm welcoming all of these folks to come and follow and put themselves and their lives and their purposes for those who God loves and we have excluded. So what does that mean? I'd like to put a fine point on it, but I'm not going to. Because as soon as we do in this, we think, oh, I've done this justice issue. I have stood with this group of people, and now for the rest of my life, I can be comfortable and do my own thing. The problem is that it always seems to be changing and moving. So we are called to listen to the voices of those who have gone before us, Peter and others, so that we too won't fall into the same traps. But the good news is, and this is important, that we will fall down. We will misuse power. We will embrace our privilege in ways. We will exclude people. We will make mistakes. But the good news is that God will not finally cast us away. We are called again and again to the ways of faithfulness. God does not call and demand our perfection. We can't give it. What God calls from us is our passion. The places where we feel life-giving, and use those in the places of God's need in the world. Where our greatest joy and the world's greatest hunger intersect is where we are called to live and be. This is the way of discipleship. For some, that will mean martyrdom. For most of us, it will not. We are not called to be heroic, just present, offering ourselves the best way we know how. But we know at the end of the day, if we are just seeking to take care of ourselves, that's not much of a life at all. So let us continue to figure out what it means to follow the one who invites us to this table and to embrace the way